Hey guys, Shalana here. Welcome to the Binge Zone. On today's video, we are going to be recapping season 1 of the Netflix original series You. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you'll get more recaps, more reviews, more breakdowns. And if you want to support the channel, consider supporting us on Patreon. But without further ado, let's dive into this recap. Season 1 opens with Beck entering a bookstore where Joe works, and Joe begins to psychoanalyze his new obsession. On his way home, Joe talks to his neighbor's kid, Paco, before Joe goes inside and investigates Beck via her social media. Joe finds Beck's address online and begins to stalk her in real life. Beck then finds out that her boyfriend Benji was cheating on her. They argue and have makeup sex. Once Benji leaves, however, Beck begins to masturbate, and Joe, who was watching from outside her window, starts whacking off in the middle of the street. Later on, Joe takes Paco to the bookstore, giving him a tour before taking him back home and confronting Paco's mother's abusive boyfriend. Joe then breaks into Beck's apartment, snooping around before continuing his investigation on Beck's laptop. After Beck's professor comes on to her, Beck goes out with her friends to a bar where she bombs at her open mic poetry reading, and Beck gets pretty drunk and goes home and stumbles onto a subway track and falls down, where Joe saves her from an oncoming train and steals her phone. Joe then leads Benji down the bookstore basement and hits him over the head before trapping him in a cage. Joe is now connected to Beck via her stolen phone, and Benji remains kidnapped in the bookstore basement. Joe and Beck then go on their first date, but it's cut short by the nuisance of Benji's disappearance. Beck and Joe become close, and she confides in him after her date with her professor ends pretty poorly. During a book release, Joe stops Paco from going down in the basement and exposing his secret that Benji's being held hostage over there. Beck then blackmails her professor into letting her keep her TA position with another advisor at the university. Beck and Joe share their first kiss at the bookstore before Joe goes downstairs and kills Benji. Beck and Joe now start dating, and Joe continues to manipulate his way into Beck's life by helping her find a new bed that he knew she needed and putting it together to further their closeness. Beck's friend Peach feigns a stomach sickness that begins to throw a wrench in the relationship between Beck and Joe. Beck wants to know more about Joe, so Joe takes her down to the basement and shows her the cage and gives her some insight as to who he is. Joe then goes to Beck's house and they begin having sex for the first time. However, it only lasts 8 seconds. After failing to satisfy Beck, Joe continues to stalk Beck via her stolen phone. Beck then meets up with Joe at the Dickens Festival, and she tells Joe the story about her father's overdose. After a heart-to-heart with her father, Beck is inspired and begins writing till we see her meet up with Joe again, and they have sex that lasts longer than 8 seconds this time. Joe becomes more involved in Beck's life, like being a part of Girls' Night where Peach and Joe suddenly begin throwing jabs at each other. Joe begins to investigate Peach, who is threatening his relationship with Beck, stalking Peach on her morning run, and where she goes to work to get a better understanding of her psyche. Peach then plans a party at Joe's bookstore so Beck can meet a publishing agent. During the party, Joe and Peach throw jabs at each other again before Joe steals her laptop, and it is revealed that Peach planned to sabotage Beck's writing career all along. Joe then manages to successfully hack into Peach's laptop and find an abundance of pictures of Beck on there. Beck then yells at Peach when she sees the truth for herself before going back to Joe's apartment and apologizing and making up before Peach interrupts them with another fake illness. Joe begins to see that he's losing this tug of war for Beck's affection and decides to assault Peach with a rock during her morning run. Joe then visits Peach a week after the assault and learns that Peach is onto him. Joe tries to tell Beck the truth about Peach's love, but she refuses to listen to him. Joe then gets into a car accident and injures his head, which causes him to hallucinate about his ex-girlfriend Candace. Joe then breaks into Peach's house and continues to hallucinate about Candace while spying on Beck and Peach. Beck and Peach get into a heated argument because Beck wants to go back and be with Joe, and Peach disapproves of the relationship. Joe is then held at gunpoint by Peach, and a struggle ensues where Joe manages to escape and shoots Peach and kills her. After the whole Peach debacle, Joe then notices a problem in his perfect relationship with Beck and talks to the therapist, Dr. Nikki. Joe then suspects that Dr. Nikki is another obstacle he needs to overcome because Dr. Nikki is also the same doctor who Beck sees. Joe and Lynn decide to throw Beck a surprise party at the bookstore, which Beck was late to because of Dr. Nikki, and Joe begins to distrust Beck. Beck then becomes distant in their relationship, so Joe goes back to stalking Beck in order to confirm his suspicions that Beck is cheating on him with Dr. Nikki. Beck then catches Joe following her and breaks up with Joe. Joe then has trouble moving on from the relationship. Joe continues to see Dr. Nikki while he moves forward with his relationship with Karen. On a date, Joe and Karen awkwardly bump into Beck at a food truck where Joe and Beck begin talking again. Joe then begins to cheat on Karen with Beck. Beck, however, pushes away from Joe, ending their affair at Ethan and Blythe's housewarming party because she believes she's not perfect for Joe. Joe in turn breaks up with Karen because he believes that Beck is perfect for him. Joe then begins to reminisce about how he met Candace, while Beck continues to inquire about Candace by asking Ethan questions about her relationship with Joe. Joe then quells Beck's suspicions about him by introducing her to Mr. Mooney, whom is responsible for teaching Joe everything he knows about books. Joe then mugs Dr. Nikki and confirms that Beck was cheating on him with her therapist and confronts her about it, but she breaks off the affair because she's in love with Joe. Beck searches above the toilet in Joe's bathroom and finds a box of Beck's things he stole, as well as items Joe stole from his murder victims. Joe then realizes Beck knows the truth about him and stops her from leaving his apartment before he kidnaps her and traps her in his cage. While in the cage, Joe admits to Beck that he killed both Benji and Peach. Joe then tries to convince Beck that his immoral action should be excused on the justification of love. After Beck's failed attempts to escape the cage, Beck begins to write a story about her life. Joe is then questioned by a private investigator over the death of Peach. Paco begins to fight back against Ron, his mother's boyfriend, and Joe intervenes and kills the boyfriend. Paco and Joe cover it up. Beck finishes her book and successfully manages to escape the cage and lock Joe in before she begins to essentially invalidate Joe as a person and why she could never love him. Joe manages to get free and the struggle ensues where Beck is caught and killed. Beck's story is published and is selling like hotcakes. Dr. Nikki's arrested for Beck's murder. Joe ties up all the loose ends, says goodbye to Paco, and the season ends with a big reveal that Kansas is not dead.